I was 74 years old the morning I found the file, and I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest. In 41 years on the bench, I never once lost sleep over a verdict. Not one. I told myself that was a virtue. I told myself it meant I had been careful, that I had done the work, that when I signed my name at the bottom of a judgment, I had earned the right to sleep like a man with clean hands. I believed that the way other men believe in God. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday in October, I moved a cardboard box that had been sitting in the corner of my garage for 31 years, and everything I believed about myself came apart in my hands. The box was heavier than it should have been. That was the first strange thing. My wife Eleanor had passed 2 winters before, and since then I had been slowly, stubbornly, going through the house the way you go through a wound. A little at a time, only when you can stand it. The garage was the last place. She never let me touch it while she was alive. "That's your museum," she used to say, laughing, because it was full of the things a man keeps when he can't quite explain to himself why he keeps them. Old law journals, a broken fishing rod my father gave me, trophies from a softball league that folded in 1988, and buried at the bottom of a stack, a plain brown banker's box with no label on it at all. I almost didn't open it. I want you to know that. I stood there in the cold garage with my knees aching and my breath fogging in front of me, and something in me, call it instinct, call it the old animal part of the brain that knows danger before the mind does, something told me to put it back where it was and go inside and make my coffee. I have thought about that moment more times than I can count. If I had listened to it, a man would have died in a prison cell, believing that the whole world had decided he was a monster. So I am glad I didn't listen. But I won't pretend it didn't cost me. It cost me everything I thought I was. I opened the box. Inside, on top, was a manila folder gone soft and brown at the edges, the way paper gets when it has been breathing the same stale air for 3 decades. And across the tab in my own handwriting, younger, firmer, the handwriting of a man in his 40s who thought he had the world figured out, was a name. State versus Ray, and under it, a case number, and under that a single word I had written and underlined twice. Hold. I sat down on an overturned milk crate, and I did not move for a long time. You have to understand what that folder was, and what it was not. When a judge finishes a case, the file goes to the clerk. It goes into the record. It becomes the property of the court and the property of history. And it does not go home with the judge and sit in a garage for 31 years. That is not how it works. That is not how it is ever supposed to work. A judge who takes a piece of a case file home has done something wrong, something that in my worst nightmares could have ended my career. And yet there it was, in my handwriting, with my note on the tab, and I had no memory, none, of ever putting it there. The name meant nothing to me at first. Ray. I had sentenced hundreds of men, thousands if you counted the small things, the pleas and the probation violations, and the drunk drivers. But then I opened the folder, and I saw the photograph clipped to the inside cover, and the whole thing came back to me all at once, the way a smell can drag you 30 years into the past against your will. Daniel Ray. 19 years old in the spring of 1986, a thin boy with a bad haircut and a jaw that hadn't finished growing into his face, wearing a suit that had clearly been borrowed from a bigger man. I remembered the suit. I remembered the way it hung off his shoulders, like it was ashamed to be there. And I remembered the charge because it was the kind of charge that empties a courtroom of air. The murder of a young woman named Carol Hutchins, 22, found dead in the tall grass behind a gas station off the county road on a morning in April, with her purse missing and her shoes missing, and the whole town screaming for someone to pay for it. They gave the town Daniel Ray, and I gave the town a sentence. Life, no parole for 40 years. I remember bringing the gavel down. I remember thinking that afternoon driving home that I had done my job well. Now I was sitting in my garage at 74, holding a folder I was never supposed to have, and my hands were starting to shake, because underneath the photograph there was a document, and the document was not part of the trial. I knew that immediately. I knew it the way you know your own child's face. It was a lab report, and it had a date stamped at the top, and the date was 3 weeks before the trial began. Let me tell you what a lab report from 3 weeks before the trial should have meant. It should have meant the jury saw it. It should have meant the defense saw it. It should have been marked as an exhibit, argued over, entered into the record, made part of the machinery of justice that grinds a man's life into a verdict. That is the law. That is not a nicety. That is not a technicality. That is the whole spine of the thing. If the state has evidence, the defense gets to see it. Every scrap, especially the scraps that might set a man free. And this report that had been sitting in my garage for 31 years, said that the blood found under Carol Hutchins' fingernails did not belong to Daniel Ray. I read it 4 times. I read it until the words stopped being words and turned into a kind of roaring in my head. Blood type, serology. In 1986, we did not have the DNA testing we have now, but we had blood typing. And the state's own laboratory had typed the blood scraped from beneath that dead girl's nails. And it was type B, and Daniel Ray was type O. And there it was in black and white, dated 3 weeks before I sat down at my bench and let a 19-year-old boy be marched off to a cage for the rest of his natural life. The jury never saw it. I would have known. I would have remembered. There was no blood evidence at that trial at all. I remembered that clearly now, because the prosecutor, a man named Gil Thornberry, had made a great show of the fact that the crime was so brutal and so sudden that the killer had left nothing of himself behind. I remembered him saying that to the jury, left nothing of himself behind. And all the while there had been a lab report, dated and signed, sitting somewhere saying that whoever killed Carol Hutchins had left a great deal of himself behind, right there under her fingernails. And it wasn't the boy in the borrowed suit. I put the folder down on the concrete floor and I was sick. I am an old man, and I do not tell you that to be dramatic. I mean that my body understood before my mind was willing to, and it turned itself inside out there in the cold. And when I was done, I sat back against the workbench and I said out loud, to no one, to Eleanor maybe, to God maybe, what did I do? But that wasn't even the worst of it, because I still didn't understand how the folder had come to be in my garage. And when I understood that, hours later, sitting at my kitchen table with the folder open in front of me and every light in the house on, because I could not stand the dark, it was so much worse than I had feared. There was a note. It was tucked into the very back of the folder, folded twice on a half sheet of yellow legal paper. And it was not in my handwriting. It was in a cramped, hurried hand I did not recognize. And it was addressed to me, not to Your Honor, not to Judge Wexler. It said at the top, Harlan, like a letter from a friend. And it said this, I have it memorized. I will have it memorized until the day I die. Harlan, I can't do this, and I can't undo it, and I can't carry it either. Gil buried the serology. He told me it was a mistake in the lab and made me file the amended report that never existed. I typed it. God help me, I typed it. I don't have the courage to burn this, and I don't have the courage to bring it forward. So I'm giving it to you because you're the only honest man in that building, and I can't stand to be the one who decides. Do what I couldn't. R. R. I sat there and I thought about who R was. And it took me the better part of an hour. And when it came to me, I had to grip the edge of the table. Ruth Delgado. She had been a paralegal in the prosecutor's office in 1986, a quiet, sharp-eyed woman of maybe 30. And I remembered now, dimly, the way you remember a stranger you passed 100 times, that she had left the county not long after the trial and moved somewhere out west, and no one had heard from her since. She had put the folder in my hand somehow, or in my office, or in a box that came home with me in the chaos of some move or some renovation, and I had never seen the note, and I had written "Hold" on the tab and put it in a box, and life had swallowed it for 31 years. No, that's the comfortable version. That's the version I told myself for about 10 minutes sitting at that table. The version where I never saw it, where it slipped past me innocently, where I was just a man to whom a terrible thing was quietly done. But I have spent my whole life listening to people construct comfortable versions of their own worst moments. And I know one when I hear it, even inside my own head. The truth is, I did not know if I had seen it. I could not remember. And a man who cannot remember whether he saw the thing that would have freed an innocent boy is not innocent himself. That is the plain fact of it. And I made myself sit with it. And it was the longest night of my life. By morning, I had made a decision. Whatever I had or hadn't done in 1986, I was going to spend whatever years I had left making it right. And I was going to start that very day, and I was not going to stop until Daniel Ray walked out of that prison a free man, or I was in the ground. The first thing I did was find out if he was still alive. You would be surprised how hard that is when you're 74 and you've been retired for 9 years, and half the people you knew in the courthouse are dead or scattered. But I had one thing going for me. I had a name that still opened doors, even doors that should have been closed to me. And so I called the Department of Corrections and I gave them the name Daniel Ray and the case number off the folder. And I waited while a young woman I had never met typed it into a computer. And then she said, "He's at Halverson. Been there since '86. And I closed my eyes and I thanked her and I hung up and I thought, 31 years. He is 50 years old. He went in a boy and he's an old man now, or nearly, and every single day of that was mine. I drove to Halverson the next week. It is a 4-hour drive and I do not drive well anymore. But I did not trust myself to sit still and wait for anything to be arranged through proper channels, because I was afraid. I will be honest, I was afraid of proper channels. I was afraid of Gil Thornberry, who was still alive, still living in a fine house on the good side of the county, still going to the club, a pillar of the community, a man who had once buried a lab report the way you'd bury a dog you'd run over in the road. I did not want the machinery to know what I knew until I had looked Daniel Ray in the eye. They almost didn't let me in. A retired judge is nobody. But an old man can be very stubborn and very patient, and eventually a guard walked me down a hall that smelled like bleach and boiled meat and a lifetime of men waiting. And they put me in a small room with a metal table bolted to the floor. And after a while, they brought him in. I would not have known him. That is the thing I keep coming back to. The thin boy in the borrowed suit was gone completely, and in his place was a heavy-set man with gray in his beard and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the flat, careful eyes of a man who learned a long time ago not to hope for anything, because hope is just another thing they can take. He sat down across from me. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, in a voice much quieter than I expected, "You're the judge." "I am," I said. "You sentenced me." "I did," he nodded slowly, like a man confirming the weather. "Come to see how it turned out?" I want to tell you that I had a speech ready. I am a man of words. I made my whole living on words. But I sat there across from Daniel Ray, and every word I had went out of me like air from a punctured tire. And what came out instead was the truth, plain and broken. "I found something," I said, "in my garage, a file that should have been at your trial and never was. It shows the blood under Carol Hutchins' fingernails wasn't yours. It never was. And I think I have to tell you that I don't know for certain that I didn't see it back then. And I've come to say I'm sorry, and that's not enough. And I know it's not enough. And I'm going to spend whatever I've got left getting you out of here anyway." He didn't say anything for a long time. His face didn't change. And then something happened that I was not prepared for, that I will carry to my grave. This man, who had every right in the world to hate me, who I had helped to bury alive for 31 years, reached across that bolted metal table, and he put his hand over mine and he said, "I stopped being angry a long time ago, Judge. Anger's heavy. Couldn't afford to carry it. But I never stopped knowing I didn't do it. And there were a lot of nights, I thought I was the only one left in the whole world who knew that." He took a breath that shook a little. "You're telling me I'm not the only one anymore?" I am not ashamed to tell you that an old judge and a lifer wept together in a prison visiting room that afternoon, and neither of us tried to hide it. I asked him, before they took him back, what those 31 years had been. I don't know why I asked. Maybe I needed to hear the shape of the thing I had done, the way a man needs to look at his own wound before he can believe it's real. And Daniel Ray thought about it for a while, turning a paper cup slowly in his big hands, and then he told me. He told me about the first 10 years, when he still believed someone would come. He wrote letters, he said, hundreds of them, to lawyers, to newspapers, to a governor who never read a word of it. He said hope in a prison is a dangerous thing to keep, because every morning it stands you up and every night it knocks you down. And after 10 years of that, a man will do almost anything to make it stop, even give up. So he gave it up. He said the day he stopped hoping was the first day he slept through the night, and he hated himself for that, because it felt like agreeing with them. It felt like signing his own name to the lie. He told me about his mother. She came every visiting day for 9 years, 4 buses each way, an old woman with a bad hip who never once believed her boy was a killer. And then, one spring, she stopped coming, and a chaplain told him she had passed in her sleep, and they would not let him go to the funeral because a man serving life is a flight risk, even to bury his own mother. He said that was the day the last of the boy in him died. He learned the trade of the place after that. He learned to fix the laundry machines, and then the heating, and then just about anything with a motor in it. And he became, over the decades, the man they called when a thing was broken, which he said with a small, dry laugh was a fine joke, because he was the most broken thing in the building, and nobody could fix him at all. I listened to all of it. I made myself listen to every word, because I had signed the order that made it, and the very least a man can do, when he cannot give back the years, is refuse to look away from what they were. Now, I said I was going to spend whatever I had left, and I meant it. But wanting a thing and getting a thing are two different animals. And the law, the same law I had served for 41 years, the same law I loved, the law does not like to admit it was wrong. It is built in 1,000 small ways to protect its own verdicts. Finality, we call it. There is a virtue in finality. You cannot have a justice system where every case is reopened forever. But finality is also a wall. And behind that wall, a great many innocent men have been left to rot. Because it is easier for the machine to keep the door shut than to admit that once, long ago, it made a mistake that cannot be forgiven. The first lawyer I went to told me it was hopeless, politely. The evidence had been obtained improperly, meaning by me out of a garage 31 years after the fact, with no chain of custody, no way to prove it was authentic, no way to prove it hadn't been fabricated by a bitter old man with something to hide, which, he pointed out gently, is exactly how the prosecutor's office would characterize it. The confession letter from Ruth Delgado was hearsay from a woman who might be dead. The lab report was a piece of paper that had been out of anyone's control for 3 decades. "Judge," he said. He still called me Judge. "I believe you. But belief isn't proof. And they will bury you. They will bury you." The same word Ruth had used. Gil buried the serology. It seemed everything in that town got buried eventually. I did not go to a second lawyer. I went to find Ruth Delgado. It took me 3 months. I am not a detective. I am an old man with a telephone and a stubborn streak, and it turned out a granddaughter named Prisha, who is very good with computers and who, when I finally broke down and told her the whole story, sat very still for a long moment and then said, "Grandpa, we are going to fix this." She found Ruth in a town in New Mexico, in a small adobe house at the end of a dirt road, and I flew out there. I, who had not been on an airplane since Eleanor's sister's funeral, because some things you cannot do over a telephone. Ruth Delgado was 79 years old and dying of the thing that was going to kill her, and she knew it. And when she opened the door and saw an old man she had not seen in 31 years, standing on her porch holding a soft brown folder, she did not ask who I was. She said, "You found it." And then she said, "Thank God." And she started to cry, and she held the door open for me to come inside. She had carried it too, all those years. Everyone in this story was carrying something they couldn't put down. She told me everything, sitting in her small kitchen with a tape recorder running, because I had learned that much from the lawyer, that this time it all had to be on the record. She told me how Gil Thornberry had come to her the week the lab report came back and told her it was wrong, a lab error, and how she had known even then that a man does not sweat like that over a lab error. She told me how he had dictated a new report, one that said the sample was insufficient for typing, and how she had typed it because she was 30 years old and she needed the job, and he was the most powerful man she had ever stood in a room with. She told me how she had made a copy of the real report before she destroyed the original, and how she had kept it in her purse for weeks, not knowing what to do with it, and how one afternoon she had slipped it into a box of the judge's papers, my papers, because I had a reputation, she said, for being the one man in that building who could not be bought or bent. And she had prayed that I would find it and know what to do. "And you didn't," she said, not cruelly, just as a fact. "You didn't find it." And I told myself that meant God wanted it buried. And I moved away and I tried to forget, and I have thought about that boy every single day of my life. I asked her the question I had to ask. I asked her if she would say all of it again, under oath, in front of anyone who needed to hear it. And this dying woman looked at me with a steadiness I will never forget. And she said, "Young man," she called me young man and I was 74, "I have been waiting 31 years for someone to ask me that question. Get your judge friends and your lawyers and your cameras. I'll say it to all of them. I'd like to be able to die having said it out loud." We flew her back, Prisha and I. We got her a hospital bed and a nurse and a lawyer, a real one this time, a young woman from an innocence project 2 states over, who took one look at that lab report and Ruth's testimony and Daniel's blood type and said, "Judge, they buried Brady evidence. This is a constitutional violation as clear as I have ever seen. We are going to win." Brady, she explained to me, though of course I knew, Brady versus Maryland, the case that says the state must turn over evidence that helps the accused. Gil Thornberry had violated Brady in 1986, the way a man violates the speed limit, casually, certain he would never be caught, because the only person who could catch him was a 30-year-old paralegal who needed her job and a judge who wasn't paying close enough attention. I have to tell you about the day we confronted Gil Thornberry, because it was not what I expected, and because in a strange way it is the part of this story that taught me the most about what people are. He was 81 by then, still in the fine house. His wife had passed, his children didn't visit much, and when I came up his front walk with the lawyer beside me, he was sitting on his porch in a cardigan, and he watched me come the whole way, and I understood, before either of us said a word, that he knew exactly why I was there. He had been waiting for this too. Maybe not for me specifically, but for someone. For the knock on the door that a man who has done what he did spends his whole life listening for. "Harlan," he said. "Gil, you found the Ray file." I stopped at the bottom of his steps. Ruth kept a copy. He closed his eyes. And then this old man, this pillar, this respected member of the bar, this monster. This old man said something I did not expect. He said, "I've been waiting 30 years to be sorry out loud." And he began to talk. And it poured out of him the way it had poured out of Ruth, the way it had poured out of me on the garage floor. All this buried grief finally finding a crack to leak through. He told us he had been certain Daniel Ray was guilty, certain in his gut, in the way prosecutors let themselves be certain, and that when the blood came back the wrong type, he had convinced himself the boy had an accomplice, that the blood belonged to some phantom second man, that the truth of Daniel Ray's guilt was bigger than one inconvenient lab report. He told us he had told himself he was serving justice, and he told us that within a year he had known, in the deepest part of himself, that he had done murder as surely as if he had put the girl in the grass himself, because he had taken a living boy and buried him. And he had done it not out of malice, but out of pride. And pride, he said, is the quiet killer that respectable men die of. He signed a statement that afternoon. He did not have to. His lawyer, when he got one, told him he was a fool. But I think Gil Thornberry had understood something that most of us understand too late, which is that there is a peace you can only buy with the truth, and it does not matter how much it costs, because the alternative is to die still carrying the thing, and he had carried it long enough. I will not pretend the law moved quickly after that, because it did not. Even with a signed confession from the prosecutor, even with a dying woman's sworn testimony, even with a lab report and a blood type, and a judge willing to stand up in open court and say, "I may have failed this man," even with all of it, the machinery ground slow. There were hearings. There were motions. There was a district attorney, a young one, who had inherited none of this and wanted nothing to do with reopening a 31-year-old murder, because there is no glory in freeing a man, only the risk of being blamed if you're wrong. I sat in courtrooms again, this time in the gallery, an old man watching younger men argue over the wreckage of the worst thing I ever did. And I learned patience the way you learn it when you have no choice. But we had one more thing. We had the blood itself. The state, in its bottomless bureaucratic thoroughness, had never thrown away the physical evidence from the Hutchins murder. It had sat in a sealed box in an evidence locker for 31 years, the fingernail scrapings preserved, forgotten, waiting. And in the years since 1986, the world had learned to read blood in a way we could not have dreamed of then. They ran the DNA. And the DNA under Carol Hutchins's fingernails, the DNA of the man who had actually killed her, came back a match to a name already in a database. A man named Vernon Tull, who had been arrested for 2 other assaults in the years after Carol died, whose DNA was on file, who had lived 20 miles from that gas station his whole life, and who had never once been looked at, because the town already had its monster in a borrowed suit, and no one goes looking for a second one. Vernon Tull had died in 2004. He would never face a jury. That is its own kind of injustice, and I have made my peace with it as best I can. But his blood spoke from wherever he was. and it said what Daniel Ray had been saying for 31 years to anyone who would listen, and to a great many who wouldn't. It wasn't me. I want to say a word about the town, because the town is a character in this story too, and not an innocent one. When the news broke, there were people who had screamed loudest for Daniel Ray's conviction in 1986. People who had stood outside the courthouse with signs, and some of them were still alive, and some of them found their way to microphones and cameras. And do you know what almost none of them said? Almost none of them said they were sorry. They said the system had failed. They said mistakes were made. They used those soft, boneless phrases that let everybody off the hook, the phrases that turn a man's stolen life into a kind of weather that simply happened, that nobody caused, that nobody has to answer for. I had used those phrases myself from the bench 100 times, and hearing them come back at me now out of other mouths was like looking in a mirror I did not want to look in. A mistake was made. No, a man made it. Several men made it, and I was one of them. And the day we all learned to say, I did this instead of mistakes were made, is the day some of the rot finally starts to lift. But that day had not come for that town, and I am not sure it ever will. There was one exception, an old woman named Della Hutchins, Carol's younger sister, who had been a teenager when her sister was murdered. She wrote me a letter. She said she had hated Daniel Ray for 31 years, had built her whole grief around him, and that when the truth came out, it was as if her sister had been killed a second time, because the man she had blamed had never done it, and the man who had was rotting in a grave beyond her reach. And then she wrote something I've kept in my wallet ever since. She wrote, I would rather carry the truth and be sick with it than carry a lie and be comfortable. Thank you for taking my comfort away. I do not think I have ever received a greater compliment or a heavier one. They freed him on a Thursday. I was there. Of course I was there. Prisha drove me because my hands were shaking too badly to hold the wheel, from age, from nerves, from a feeling I did not have a name for. The courtroom was full. There were cameras, the young lawyer had seen to that, because she said the town that had screamed for his conviction needed to watch his exoneration. And she was right. Daniel Ray was brought in one last time in the county jumpsuit, and the judge, a woman younger than my own daughter, read the order vacating the conviction, and she said the words that undo a life sentence. And then she looked at Daniel Ray over her glasses, and she did something I have never seen a judge do in 50 years around courtrooms. She came down from the bench. She walked down off that high place where I had sat for 41 years, and she crossed the well of the court, and she took his hand in both of hers, and she said, Mr. Ray, on behalf of a system that failed you, I am sorry. You are free to go. The sound that went up in that room I will hear for the rest of my life. Daniel Ray was 50 years old the day he walked out of that courthouse into the light. He had gone in at 19. His mother had died while he was inside. His father had died before that. The girl he'd been sweet on in 1986 was a grandmother now with a husband and a life he had no part in. The world he walked back into had cell phones and a president he'd never voted for, and prices that made no sense, and not one single person in it who had been waiting at the door. Nobody, except an old judge and his granddaughter, standing on the courthouse steps in the October light. He walked up to me, and I braced myself because I had spent a year and a half getting ready for whatever he wanted to say to me, the man who signed his life away. And he stopped in front of me, and he looked at me for a long moment. And then Daniel Ray put his arms around me, this old man who had ruined him, and he held on, and into my shoulder he said, You came back for me. Everybody else forgot. You came back. I want to tell you that this is where the story ends, with justice done and an innocent man free and an old judge's conscience clean at last. But I told you at the beginning that I was a man who had never lost sleep over a verdict, and that finding this file took everything I thought I was and broke it in my hands. And I owe you the truth about what that means. Getting Daniel Ray out did not make me clean. There is no ledger where one good deed at 74 cancels one catastrophic failure at 43. Daniel Ray lost 31 years, and I cannot give them back to him. Not with a settlement, not with an apology, not with the small foundation Prisha and I started to help him build some kind of life. He is free now, and he is kind to me, kinder than I deserve. And we have dinner most Sundays, and he is teaching me slowly that a man can be forgiven for a thing even when the thing cannot be undone. That has been the hardest lesson of my long life, and I am still learning it. But I have started to sleep again. Not the untroubled sleep of the man I used to be, the one who was so proud that his verdicts never haunted him. I know now that a man whose verdicts never haunt him isn't careful. He's asleep in a different and more dangerous way. He has stopped seeing the human being in the borrowed suit. He has started to believe that the machine he serves cannot be wrong, and that is the exact moment a good judge becomes a dangerous one. So I sleep the sleep of a man who has finally woken up, and every so often, in the quiet, I think about the note in Ruth's cramped hand, the note that called me the only honest man in that building, and I think about how close I came to never opening that box, and I say a kind of prayer, not that I be made clean, because I don't think that's on offer, but that I stay awake. That whatever years I have left, I stay awake. I found a forgotten case file in my garage on an ordinary Tuesday in October. I had been telling myself for 31 years that I was a good man because I slept well. It turned out I slept well because I had let myself forget the one thing a judge can never afford to forget: that behind every case number is a living person, and that the most dangerous words in the English language are, "The system doesn't make mistakes like that." It does. It did. It made one with my name on it. I am an old man now, and I do not have long. But I have Sundays with Daniel Ray, and I have a granddaughter who taught me that it is never too late to fix a thing you broke, and I have the memory of a young judge coming down off her bench to take a free man's hand, which is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen in a courtroom. And I have this, which I am telling you now so that it does not die with me. Check the box. Whatever your box is, wherever you have let something heavy sit in the dark because opening it might cost you everything you think you are, open it. Open it while you still can. Because the thing you're afraid to find in there might just be a man's whole life, waiting 31 years in the dark for someone honest enough to let the light in. His name was Daniel Ray. He was innocent. And I will spend the rest of my days grateful that an old man's aching knees carried him into a cold garage on the one morning it mattered most.